Hi. Let's talk about 1917.
Some of the most prominent films in cinema have utilized the long take in some form or another. Gravity kept us terrified and mesmerized while adrift in space. Children of Men kept us trapped in a car as a mob descended upon the characters. The Protector had one of the most batshit insane journeys up a staircase in cinema history. Even Orson Welles used a technique to bring another level of storytelling to Touch of Evil. And before you start, yes, I know movies like Russian Ark and Victoria are legitimate one-take films, as opposed to long one-takes within a film or multiple long takes strung together. Shout out to Hitchcock for getting that trend started in the 40s. Looking out, my guy. But of all those films, can you honestly find me one where they also decided to build each location as the actors move step by step through the environment? No? That's because Sam Mendes is out of his goddamn mind, and that is exactly what this movie called for. Now, before we throw on our Union Jack swimming suits and cannonball into the mud-soaked and trench-deep end, let's actually talk about my man Sam for a second. Sam Mendes is probably a name you should already be familiar with, especially when I remind you that he helmed, in no particular order, Skyfall, American Beauty, Revolutionary Road, Jarhead, and, because he just couldn't get enough of Daniel Craig's dreamy eyes, went for seconds with Spectre. And before he even touched the silver screen, he was directing the likes of Ethan Hawke and Judi Dench on the stage. In the 20 years since this guy dropped American Beauty, his films have won a combined 37, yes, 37 awards. And this guy has been knighted. So if anyone had the chops to take on a project of this scale, it would most certainly be him. But because he's such a team player and wanted to take this bad boy to the next level, he brought in Roger Deakins, aka the greatest cinematographer of all time, and Thomas Newman, who's been gracing our ears with his scores since as far back as Revenge of the Nerds and The Shawshank Redemption. And one of the best decisions he made early on with this film was choosing to go with actors who were relatively unknown for the leads. Oftentimes, when we see an actor or actress show up, we automatically start guessing their intentions and behavior patterns based on their previous works. Sean Bean is seen as an amazing actor who dies in 90% of the things he's in. Anthony Hopkins is always wise and insightful, if a bit crazy. And Angelina Jolie is usually the attractive and aloof badass.
Ain't that just the way?
But the dreamboat combo that is Dean Charles Chapman and George McKay are fresh faces that allow us to further be sucked into the story. There are no preconceived notions of how they may act or what might happen to them, and as a result, every step they take is filled with dread and suspense. That being said, Mendes also made the great choice to fill the supporting cast roster with some fantastic names to make the setting feel larger than life. Since there are no traditional cuts from scene to scene, running into veteran actors like Colin Firth, Andrew Scott, Mark Strong, and Benedict Cumberbatch serve as a pseudo-checkpoint for the character's journey, as well as giving more life and character to the war front that these two are traveling through. Quick side note, during the brief scene where Schofield is riding on the back of the truck with some of the other soldiers, there's an Indian amongst them. India had over 1 million troops participating in the war, but it's a fact I don't often see talked about, so I wanted to go ahead and give them their props. The film focuses on two British soldiers, Lance Corporal Schofield and Blake. Blake is clearly seen as the younger and more optimistic of the pair, early on speaking about going home by Christmas, mentioning dispatches from back home, and generally being very vocal about wanting to see action. But Schofield is already shown to be wary of the war and his place in it. His very first on-screen action, or inaction I should say, is to pretend to still be asleep, thus avoiding being picked for whatever assignment has just come through. But once he realizes that Blake won't want to pick anyone else, he drops the facade and stands up. Even a few minutes later in the film, he scolds Blake for picking him, stating,
"Why in God's name did you have to choose me? I didn't know what I was picking you for. No, you didn't. You never know. That's your problem."
And in the opening minutes, he's only really responsive with a disgruntled look and only really talking in short replies. He even casually mentions that he traded his war medal for a bottle of wine, a fact that utterly bewilders Blake as he himself wants one. But the experience and personality gap is most notable in how they deal with the mission they are given. Schofield is very much cautious, attempting to compromise with Blake, suggesting that they wait until dark to begin their journey.
Look, the last time I was told the Germans were gone, it didn't end well.
He ran into literal hell as he was one of the survivors of the Somme. Sidebar, the Battle of the Somme is still considered one of the bloodiest battles in all of human history, with almost 4 million men participating in the battle and over 1 million casualties. So not only should his ability to fight and survive be apparent to you straight away, it gives much more context as to why he's able to shrug things off like his head injury and getting his hand dipped in that gross dead horse corpse.
Why in God's name did you have to choose me?
However, Blake is in the exact opposite camp, having very little experience on how gruesome the conflict really is. He heads out straight away, not giving a single thought to his well-being, or for that matter, Schofield's. His only real thoughts are to save his brother and the rest of the men walking into that trap, and despite the hazards they immediately run into, Blake gives no thoughts about turning back. Which brings me smoothly to my next point.
Last man standing.
The First World War was nothing short of a nightmare. Countless cities and communities destroyed, untold number of casualties, and destruction to the very earth that can still be seen today. And while we have plenty of photographs to look back to, Mendes wanted to bring as much of the devastation and ruin to us as possible, even though we only get a fraction of a moment to really let it all sink in at times. From the moment the characters step onto no man's land, there are numerous human and horse corpses that they don't even acknowledge, either because, like us, they are focused too hard on going straight ahead on the path they've been told to follow, or because they're so used to looking over their parapet and seeing the dead on a daily basis. When they get to the other side of the German trench, they see piles of artillery shells as tall as 2 men, indicating just how many have already died on their side as a result of the heavy shelling for months or even years. When they travel through the grassland, they comment on how the Germans have cut down food-bearing trees and killed livestock so the advancing British wouldn't be able to use them for supplies. When we arrive at Akust, the city has already long since been ravaged by the fighting, and the very river Schofield later escapes into is littered with bodies, some even being civilians. Yet he doesn't give a second thought to climbing over them to make his way out of the riverbank. And when we finally reach the Second Devons and he delivers his message, it's in the midst of even more artillery shelling and gunfire. This movie doesn't glorify death or the war. It doesn't shock for shock value, and it doesn't make these men out to be special, unbreakable soldiers. It simply shows you the grim reality of what millions of men face day after day for years, and the kind of courage and sacrifice it took to end such a monstrous conflict. We may only see a day in the life of these men, but they serve as the perfect microcosm for the struggles of soldiers on the Western Front. Early on, in his interview with Rotten Tomatoes, Sam Mendes says something that really speaks to the core of what they were attempting.
We had to construct this dance between the actors, the camera, and the landscape, which is constantly moving through that.
He further goes on to point out that this production, more than anything, is a feat of engineering. They had to create several pieces of new camera rig tech to allow the crew to move alongside the actors as they moved. The opening trench set piece alone took months of planning and weeks of labor. They had to wait hours each day sometimes to make sure that the cloud thickness was right to keep certain scene continuity. No joke, they took McKay and Chapman out into open fields with their scripts and timed and measured their steps as they walked and rehearsed their scenes so the production team could figure out how big of a set piece to build. They said something to the effect of, if it takes you 9 or 10 paces for your character to hear a line, think about it, and then respond, then take those 9 or 10 paces. Don't simply fire your line out right away. They wanted the conversations to feel just as organic as the environment did. The level of effort and dedication by the entire production crew cannot be overstated. And all of this stemmed from one amazing point that I want to leave this episode on. This was the first film Mendes ever wrote himself. He had spent most of his career bringing to life other people's work and never attempted a true project of his own, and I'll let him explain why.
I suppose I'd always wanted to, in an ideal world, I'd always wanted to be one of those guys who can sit down and write the movie I wanted to make, but I never felt motivated to do it, partly because I didn't think of myself as a great writer, and when you're being offered scripts by people who are better than you, you should do those instead.
But after his work with the Bond series, he had the motivation to really push his own vision. This was a story that came from his head as much as it came from his heart. His grandfather filled his head with these stories of bravery and death, and they stuck with him throughout his career and his life. When he was finally presented with a true opportunity to tell a story he wanted to tell, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that this was the end result.
I know my way is rough and steep.
So allow me to sum up by saying this. The film teaches us that sometimes every single step you take can be a grueling journey that you have no other choice but to take because you care about others. But with this film, Mendes teaches us that you shouldn't be afraid to take a chance and create something you want the way you want it, because it just might turn out beautifully. It was because of that lesson I decided to start this channel to begin with, so it's no coincidence that this was the first film I wanted to speak about. But I'm curious, what do you think?
I'm only going over Jordan.